that you are joining us for this launch of the seminar, of the webinars. It is fantastic to see you here. And on that note, congratulations, Itziar, for being the Calvo winner last year. So just to introduce Itziar, who will be our first presenter for the webinar. She holds a double degree in law and international relations from the University of Deusto, and she completed the International Masters in Sociology of Law at the Oñate Institute. As I just said, she won the Manolo Calvo Prize in 2022 for her thesis, and she's currently a pre-doctoral researcher in the philosophy of law at the Department of the University of the Basque Country. Today, Itziar is going to talk to us about her work that is titled Problematizing Sexual Consent in Spanish Rape Law, Gender Norms and the Manifestation of Sexual Will. We probably will agree that this is a very, very poignant topic at the time, not only in Spain, but globally. So Itziar is drawing on feminist approaches to examine the extent to which the element of sexual consent plays a role in the redefinition of the Spanish rape law, and how does this capture women's sexual will. So I will just stop there in terms of the abstract, but we're also delighted to have with us Malena Maceira. Thank you for being here, Malena, who will also be our presenter in the November session, but we'll tell you more about later. Malena is an Argentine criminal lawyer from the University of Buenos Aires, and she also has a master's in sociology of law from Oñate. She currently holds a position at the Basque Institute of Criminology as a doctoral researcher. So welcome Malena, welcome Itziar. The presentation will be 20 minutes and I'll be very strict. We hope to keep these webinars to an hour because we know we are all very busy and it's summer and it's probably very hot where you are. So I promise to keep it to an hour tops. So I will, Itziar, I will let you know when you have 2 minutes left so you can wrap up your presentation. But now over to you and thank you again for sharing your work with us.
Thank you very much for your words, Claudia. I'm trying to share my screen now. Okay. So, well, hello again, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the Oñate community for choosing my work to begin this wonderful webinar series, and especially, of course, the committee that is organizing these meetings to talk about gender matters. So Barbara Giovanni Velo, Claudia Orlando, Nicoleta Picrameno, and Telmila Moura, thanks a lot for having me here today. Also, I would like to mention my colleague at the Euskal Herriko Unibertsitatea, Malena Maceira, for providing her always inspiring perspective. Finally, thanks to the ones who are online here today. I hope you find my presentation attractive and somehow thought-provoking. The work that I'm presenting today, as I have said, is the master's thesis that I developed in the framework of the International Masters in Sociology of Law at the Oñate Institute. As it has been commented also, this work was awarded with the Manolo Calvo Prize in 2022. This award came at the perfect moment for me. My insecurities have always conditioned me, and the prize provided me with great source of self-confidence and motivation to move forward in my professional path. Also, this acknowledgement was even more special due to the fact that it was given in honor of the Professor Manolo Calvo, who dedicated a great deal of work to research on violence against women. Additionally, this award gave me the visibility for participating in the conference called Together Against Patriarchal Violence, organized by the Aragonese Women's Institute of the Government of Aragon. It was, in fact, an experience that I enjoyed a lot and that I'm still assimilating today. So, well, my research, as I have also said, is entitled Problematizing Sexual Consent in Spanish Rape Law, Gender Norms, and the Manifestation of Sexual Will. For this presentation, I will address the following points. Introduction, selection of the theoretical framework, selection of the method, main findings of the empirical analysis, and conclusions. So as you can barely see here, I try to develop a not very complicated but logical structure to make the work more readable and easy to understand at the first glance. As probably you can see it follows the classical sections: introduction, theoretical framework, empirical analysis, and conclusions. So the research context. Focusing on its social legal context, sexual violence has experienced an extraordinary rise in social awareness in the last 50 years that has brought multiple legislative reforms. Nonetheless, this has not resulted in a satisfactory regulation, and women continue to be subject to the system of sexual terror, as we know, in a structural way. Therefore, that's why I believe it is crucial to challenge and problematize legislative policies that are supposed to have a feminist pretension or that are supposed to respond to feminist demands. Concretely, the social legal European juncture currently prompts policies towards a consent-based rape law. And in Spain, this resulted in the new law that finally entered into force the 7th of October 2022, known as the Only Yes Means Yes law, whose legislative process is our today's focus. If you want, we can talk later about the public debate that has recently taken place in relation to this law. Well, so in the development of my research, it was important for me to situate both myself as an author and the study. As a researcher, I identify my situated and partial viewpoint as a white, Spanish, cishet, middle-class woman, conditions that pierce and influence my knowledge. Besides, I position myself politically as a feminist, something that also affects the decisions that I make during the research process. Also, my specific use of concepts to name and give meanings to certain dynamics and practices is not a neutral exercise, but informs the particular historical, geopolitical, and epistemic context in which I situate myself. On the other hand, the project, situated in the post-Me Too era, is framed within feminist critical legal theory, adopting a critical perspective of society, which is very common in feminist epistemology, implies an intention to change the status quo. Concretely, my research draws mainly on arguments from radical feminism and post-structuralist feminism. Additionally, the use of certain concepts requires some clarifications. Probably the most important for the understanding of the research that is that I employ the term violence beyond its legal understanding and not necessarily implying physical violence. I am referring to the spectrum of violence, which has different forms of distribution and intensity. That is, in the same way that Liz Kelly describes it as a continuum and not only about particular and individual actions. According to the aim of my work, which is to contribute to the theoretical and empirical knowledge base about the current notion of sexual consent in Spain in order to understand the potentialities and constraints of this legal element to reflect women's sexual experiences, and according to the research questions that I pose and that you can read there at the slide, I work from a qualitative research plan and adopt a feminist methodology. This generally implies the pretension of a non-androcentric epistemology and the rejection of neutrality. Also, I design my research through the interaction of two different methods, literature review and critical policy analysis. The key point here is that there is a great level of coherence between them, since both the feminist theoretical argumentation selected and the concrete method chosen for empirical analysis seek to unveil the presumed basic assumptions that exist behind certain practices. I will now go into more detail on the reasoning for this methodological choice. So concerning the selection of the theoretical framework, when I looked at certain crucial theoretical contributions of the 20th century, I found many answers were illuminating to contemporary problems and which were and these argumentations were not internalized even within feminism. That is, identified a kind of gap or oblivion within current feminism. Due to this, I decided to establish a dialogue between some of the main theoretical contributions of the 1970s and 1980s and the demands of current institutional feminism in Spain, which allowed me to understand these prior theoretical argumentations not only are not anachronistic today, but in fact sometimes offer more complete, profound, and critical answers to the challenges of feminism today. The reason why I chose these 2 decades, 1970s and 1980s, is that in these two decades, feminists amplified the notion of rape, understood it is permeated with political content, and they also scrutinized the power of law. In 1970s, I focused on the masterpieces of these 2 radical feminists who, among others, unveiled the political link between sexuality and rape. These authors describe how both concepts, rape and sex, are underpinned by the same gender power relations. Put differently, according to the authors, masculine hostility is a constant factor in patriarchal sexuality. What changes is the frankness with which it is exposed. And this is a crucial idea. This hostility, masculine hostility, or violence in a wide sense, is constant in patriarchal sexuality. In the next decade, in the 1980s, I pay attention to these 2 legal feminists, Catherine McKinnon and Carol Smart. In the same line, both authors see sexuality as a social sphere of masculine power, where coercion is an integral part. No? And this is also an important idea. They understand that separating rape from sex is a mistake, since it would mean that there is no violence to problematize in the latter. There is no violence to problematize in sex. And consequently, the violence that happens in sex, in the so-called normal sex, is naturalized. That is, it is important to understand rape as just one part of this continuum of sexual violence. Both McKinnon and Smart state that patriarchal ideas construct and permeate the legal system, since men dictate sexual habits, men establish hierarchies in sexual practices, and men define sexual concepts as consent is. So men consider the coercion that is normal in sex, and therefore it is not punished, but actually is eroticized. Nonetheless, the legal system presumes there is a single valid and objective reality. Due to this, measuring sexual consent from an objective legal point of view means men's point of view. My theoretical framework is also composed by contemporary contradictory feminist approaches to sexual consent. I briefly show how sexual consent currently traces an ambivalent path within feminism between the majority acceptance of institutionalized feminism and the rejection of many activists and scholars. Recently, the outbreak of Me Too, the Me Too movement, locating people's sexual experiences at the center of the dialogue, was able to challenge legal concepts and mechanisms that address sexual violence, as sexual consent is. And this movement put emphasis on testimonies. The most significant thing here is that these have the power to expose the sexual violence that exists beyond legal frameworks. Consequently, Me Too succeeded to challenge the limits of the formal definition of sexual violence. That is, this international digital movement questioned the authority of the law as the only truth, as Carol Smart would explain. However, as we know, criminal law nowadays continues to occupy a privileged place in the treatment and execution of cases of sexual violence against women. Regarding the selection of the method, the one that I use for my empirical analysis was developed by the Canadian-Australian political scientist and professor Carol Bucky. This method, called What's the Problem Represented to Be approach, seeks to, and I quote, disrupt taken for granted truths. And it puts the focus on what is presumed and not examined. Being Foucauldian inspired, as Bucky says, this tool of critical analysis is aimed at making politics visible. The focus then is on questioning what is most presumed. Using this method, my object of study is the criminal policy discourse underpinning or underlying the legislative amendment that introduces consent-based rape law in Spain. For this, I use my written and oral primary sources, which are the preparatory works for the legislative amendment and some specific political debates that took place in the Spanish Congress of Deputies and in the Equality Commission. These sources allow me to study the interactive process of legal and political construction of the notion of consent in Spain, and they are discursive practices with great power of social influence. I examine their underlying assumptions, taken for granted truths, gaps, and contradictions. For this, I answer some of the guiding questions proposed by Carol Bucky in order to analyze how the legal and political discourse represents and therefore constructs the specific problem. So, approaching the main findings, first of all, although the bill is gender neutral, it claims women and girls are the principal victims of sexual violence. According to this representation, also the problem, this representation of the problem, the legal political discourse, the key question here in this legal political discourse is the insufficient legal weight of consent in the protection of women's sexual freedom. Also, despite including multidisciplinary responses, the lack of sexual freedom is represented as an essentially criminal problem. Moreover, this policy discourse represents consent as the ultimate solution to the problem of sexual violence, as a panacea, so to say. So how has this representation of the problem achieved legitimacy? To achieve legitimacy, this problem is shown to be part of a broader historical debate. In this same line, the representation uses the deeply accepted discourse of citizenship and human rights, this related to the compliance with the rule of law. And also there is a repeated allusion to the international dimension of the problem and the measures taken. Besides, framed within institutionalized feminism, the policy discourse constantly alludes to the feminist movement, what evokes popular representation and obtains legitimacy in this way. For example, it adopts feminist slogans and theoretical contributions and even names feminist figures. For example, in the extracts that we can read here, it says, for instance, to respond to the demands and needs raised by the feminist movement at the international level so that the strengthening of women's human rights has a global scope. Or, for example, it is essential and urgent for the regulation to adapt to the best and highest international standards. So, also, this present criminal policy does not stand out for a radical revision of legal methodology, but is based on its solid formalism. That is, the policy accepts the authority of law as the only truth of the events, and in this way reinforces it. Consequently, this policy is constructed within the narrow legal framework of violence against women and does not address the whole continuum of sexual violence that we have mentioned before. That is, it only calls violence to a part of this continuum of violence, and the rest of this whole spectrum of violence remains unchallenged. Besides this, the lack of contestation by political parties towards the concept of consent shows it is assumed as a universal, neutral, clear, and immutable concept, when in fact it is an empty concept that can be filled with very different contents. Also, this policy discourse produces gender as external stereotypes that remain on the surface of the person and forgets the form in which it operates in the inner part of individual. That is, the discourse forgets that gender performativity creates gender expectations that affect and shape our behavior, and extensively that affect and shape our manifestation of sexual will. Furthermore, the concept of consent is built through this legal binary consent or non-consent. Consequently, the complexity of sexuality is simplified and the possible ways of manifesting sexual will are reduced. Finally, there is a contradiction in the conceptual logic of this discourse, this policy discourse. It, on the one hand, recognizes the collective and structural character of violence, but on the other, the legal response offered by consent is an individualized response detached from the structural context. This means perpetuating the status quo of patriarchy. Related to this, the present policy, through the enhancement of individual consent, contributes to the creation of the functional subjectivity for the neoliberal system. This is the rational liberal subject. Consent is seen as an individual decision that is not conditioned by the structural context of patriarchy. In this way, women are encouraged to believe that they have absolute freedom over their individual bodies and sexualities, and that their decisions have not a collective dimension or meaning. So to conclude, I will give you very briefly 4 ideas. First of all, from the findings exposed, it can be concluded that the element of consent misrepresents women's sexualities and does not meet women's life experiences. Consent distorts and simplifies the experience of manifesting sexual will, and the selective criminal intervention continues to silence certain realities of women's oppressions. Secondly, consent collaborates in the hegemonic discourse of neoliberal patriarchy. Under the premise of exercising full individual sexual freedom, as I have said, women are abandoned to their fate in a web of structural power operations. Consequently, women live in a constant uncertainty about the true freedom of their sexual decisions. Also, studying sexual consent in Spain shows how institutionalized feminism in the country widely contradicts principal contributions of feminist theory on sexual violence in many ways. Moreover, the dynamics and concepts of the legal system, as consent is, hinder a deeper understanding of sexual violence. Adhering to these legal principles and legal concepts results in our conversations being shaped by these legal conceptual boundaries and limits. Due to this, I guess it is necessary to develop new dialogues out of legal parameters that enable us to expose all the harmful sexual experiences and to understand that our sexual behaviors go beyond the realm of sexuality itself. That's all for now. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Itziar. That was perfect timing. You even have 2 minutes left, so I didn't have to interrupt you. So brilliant.
Nice.
Thank you so much for staying within the time. And it's just such an interesting presentation that I think is just, we can take hours discussing this. So I'm just encouraging people to please make comments or questions in the chat box while the presentation is going. But now I'm just going to pass the baton to Malena, please.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction, Claudia, and congratulations on starting these seminars. I'm quite excited about them. I mean, of course, there's never enough spaces to talk about gender and feminism ever, like in the world. So one more space to discuss these topics, for me, it's quite interesting and a reason to celebrate. Well, what to say? I mean, first of all, thank you, Itziar, for letting me be your discussant. I mean, for us particularly, this is quite an interesting reunion because Itziar and I were colleagues at the same cohort in the master in Oñati. So I saw Itziar's whole process of how choose a topic and proceeding to design the methodology and actually start doing it. So I want to focus particularly to do this comment to her work, which I have read in so many versions, but at the same time, this is an interesting exercise to take some distance from her work and to rethink about the importance that it has. And it is that mainly she's working on a concept, which is something that we cannot put a definition on, which is consent in a way. From the social legal perspective, we're trying to underpin a definition of consent through diverse strategies, and we can only observe how those strategies are working among each other. And this is why I think this kind of work, this kind of research is so important, because we can define how it's not well defined, actually, what's not the scope of it. So you're trying to elaborate an idea, which I think it's quite interesting, that it's related to, on the one hand, you find that law defines consent, but at the same time, it's not taking into account sexual will, right? So this leads me to the relationship that you are observing all along your work regarding how do women arrive to the protection of the law. In particular, how there's always the idea that solution will come from hand of criminal law, right? Like punitive perspectives on criminal law, how we're going to stand ourselves in front of rape, or how we're going to put ourselves into strategies that will prevent society and will comply with international agreements regarding violence against women, more particularly in sexual violence. So I think within this context, it's extremely relevant to be aware of some main issues that you mentioned real well throughout your whole research, which is, what about the victims? How do women arrive to justice regarding the access of justice, to justice? Like you mentioned in your work, this whole idea of how do victims stand in front of a court, and the characteristics of a patriarchal justice system. It's another branch of your research. You're focusing on a law, but of course the implications of the law is that it eventually will be applied. And this is something that I will come around after my small comment. Well, perhaps it's no longer that small anymore. Sorry about that. Another thing that I want to underline is the phrase that you mentioned, which is quite interesting, that says, men define this crime by separating it from what they normally do. You're quoting McKinnon. And this, I think, it's pretty much existential in your work. You're talking about how we're trying to define a conduct that has one element that's quite relevant, which is women consent. But we are observing it from male gaze that makes a division based on primal instinct desires that are legal and those that are actually acceptable, that are related to a smaller submission of women that is considered just sex, right? So if we're not taking into account the concept of will, sexual will, what it means for women, I think we're completely lost. And why? Because we're trying to make it work with the law, with all that implies with it. And I think you escape, and you pointed out really good, I'm sorry, this is not me pointing to you, this is pointed out the problem. You pointed out really good the situation that you took a problem that is quite often observed at the academia, which is, what about the role of academia when thinking the laws? You mentioned about two professors in your work, I don't remember, they were both Spanish, that were part of the commission of the revision of the law. And actually this is an ongoing debate. So what about the role of academia? We as scholars, feminist scholars, can we participate in those debates? Because our position, it's being, I don't know, counterbalanced in a way. Should we accept some, I don't know, middle points that we agree on, or should we be more exigent about that from our perspective of academics, or not?